The silence of the Montana mountains has always been my refuge, especially now. As I watch the sunrise paint the lake golden from the window of my cabin, I feel that familiar mix of peace and loneliness. My name is William Turner, a 32-year-old forest engineer, freshly transferred to this district after what I thought would be a lifetime with someone. Trees don't ask questions. Conservation reports don't require any explanation as to why I'm living alone in a cabin that seems way too big for one person. And maybe that's why I've thrown myself into work these past few months. My days follow a comforting routine. I wake up to the first chorus of birds, brew a strong coffee while reviewing trail maps, and spend hours cataloging species or visiting researchers. At night, the fireplace and my technical books keep me company. Some might call it loneliness. I call it peace. If you too have ever found solace in the silence when everything seems too noisy, you'll totally understand. What comes next? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get more stories like this. The morning air here has a smell no cologne could ever capture. Pine, damp earth, and that mist hanging over the lake like a blanket. My cabin is on the edge of the national park, a place where the stars seem close enough to reach out and touch. Built of dark wood, my retreat boasts huge windows that frame the mountains like ever-changing pieces of art. In winter, the snow turns everything into a world of white and silence. In spring, the colors explode as if nature were making up for months of hibernation. My routine hardly ever changes. I hike the trails with my worn-out notebook, check on preservation areas, and occasionally guide groups of scientists through the park's most protected areas. I know every tree, every twist of a river, every rock formation. This predictability has been my safe harbor. The evenings are mine. I sit on the porch with a local craft beer, watching the sky shift from blue to indigo, then to a pitch black blanket studded with stars. In those moments, I feel that the distance I put between myself and the rest of the world might have been greater than necessary. The management's email arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. A conservation conference in Denver, 2 days long, mandatory attendance. Normally I'd have found some excuse to avoid it, even just reading the list of attendees. Ethan Rodriguez. I hadn't seen that name outside social media for almost 5 years. My best buddy from college, now a wildlife biologist in Yellowstone. According to the email, we'd be sharing a hotel room to optimize the department's budget. The 3-hour drive to Denver gave me enough time to mentally rehearse our reunion. I pictured animated conversations about work, maybe a few, laughs reminiscing about our college days. What I hadn't expected was the knot in my stomach when I saw him in the hotel lobby. "Will, man, it's been too long." His hug was the same, strong and sincere, but there was something in his eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. "Ethan, good to see you." I tried to sound casual as we headed up to the room. "So, wildlife in Yellowstone? I always knew you'd end up surrounded by bears." We spent hours talking about work. He raved about a new wolf reintroduction program. I shared the challenges of forest management, but I noticed how he dodged personal questions, how his shoulders would tense up when the talk turned to relationships. After the first day of boring lectures, we explored Denver together. We had dinner at a small, noisy Mexican restaurant where Ethan knew the chef. "Remember that time we camped near Lake Michigan and you swore you saw a bear?" I asked between sips of a local beer. His laugh was genuine for the first time. "It was a bear, or at least a really big raccoon." The familiarity slowly returned. The way he gestured when talking about things he was passionate about. The way he furrowed his brow when disagreeing about something. For a few hours, it felt like time had stood still. Back in the room, sitting on separate beds, the conversation drifted to the projects we dreamed of tackling someday. Ethan spoke passionately about habitat preservation, but something in his enthusiasm seemed restrained. The next morning, everything changed. Ethan was in the bathroom when I woke up. 30 minutes passed before he came out, his eyes slightly red, avoiding my gaze as he mumbled something about breakfast. During the conference sessions, he sat away from me. At lunch, he chatted animatedly with other researchers, but whenever I approached, his energy visibly dropped. In the afternoon, the announcement, a snowstorm was coming. Flights were canceled, and roads might be blocked. We'd be stuck in the hotel for at least One more night. You okay? I asked when we finally met in the room. It seems like you're avoiding me. I'm tired, that's all. His answer was too quick. Dinner was an awkward, silent affair at the hotel restaurant. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, turning Denver into a snow globe. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. As I watched Ethan fiddle with his food without really eating it, I realized there was something deep troubling him. The forced closeness of our small room seemed to intensify every internal conflict he was facing. Then he abruptly got up. I need some space. And he disappeared back into the room's bathroom for almost an hour, leaving me outside, confused and worried about the friend I thought I knew. The storm outside intensified, battering the hotel, windows with snow and wind. Inside the room, a different kind of storm was forming, one made up of silence and unspoken words. I checked my watch. An hour and 20 minutes with Ethan locked in the bathroom. This was not normal. I moved toward the door, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. Ethan, man, you okay in there? I knocked softly, trying not to sound as worried as I felt. Silence. Ethan, I'm getting really worried. Say something. I heard a deep sigh on the other side. I'm fine, Will. I just need a minute. You said that an hour ago. I leaned my head against the door. Look, if I did something to upset you, just tell me. If you need me to leave for a bit, I can go down to the lobby. The door swung open so abruptly I almost stumbled. Ethan was there, red-eyed, his hair tousled like he'd run his fingers through it 100 times. It's not you. His voice came out rough. It never was you. He passed by me like a ghost, sitting at the far end of the bed. The yellow light from the lamp cast long shadows around the room, emphasizing the tense lines on his face. The faint scent of hotel soap mixed with the lingering aroma of coffee we had shared earlier. What's going on? You disappeared all day and now this. I moved closer slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. We've been friends for how long? 15 years? You can tell me anything. He stared down at his hands, fingers interlocked so tightly the knuckles went white. Sometimes, he began, then stopped. He took a deep breath. Sometimes, I feel like I've been living a lie. Like I built this persona, this Ethan that everyone knows, and I'm not sure where the mask ends and who I really am begins. I sat on the opposite side of the bed, keeping enough distance but close. Enough so he knew I was there. The wind howled outside, underscoring the weight of every word. What kind of lie? I asked softly. Finally, his eyes met mine, heavy with a mix of fear and relief. The lie of who I am, of what I'm supposed to be. Ethan suddenly got up and walked to the window. The city was disappearing under a white blanket of snow. For a long moment, he just stood there, as if looking for answers in the pattern of falling flakes. I met someone in Yellowstone. His voice was almost a whisper. A visiting researcher. We spent a lot of time together during a field project. I waited, feeling that every word was another step on a tightrope for him. We started getting close in a way I've never felt before. There was this connection that went beyond work or even ordinary friendship. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. But he was a man, Will. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of that confession. I then understood the torment in his eyes, the hours he'd spent hiding, the distance he was creating. And that scared you. It wasn't a question. It terrified me. He turned to face me, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. Not because of what I felt, but because I'd never even considered this possibility before. I'm 33, Will. How can I be questioning something so fundamental at this point? Life doesn't come with a manual, Ethan. I stood up, closing the gap between us. People figure things out about themselves at different times. Maybe I'm not as straight as I thought I was. Those words slipped out as if they'd been trapped for a long time, finally finding freedom. His eyes fixed on mine, searching for judgment, rejection, anything that might confirm his fears. Instead, I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder. The contact seemed to ground him. You're still the same Ethan I've always known, I said. None of this changes who you are to me. Something broke in his expression, like a dam, finally giving way after holding back for too long. His shoulders slumped, and I could see the effort he was making not to completely fall apart. I'm scared, Will. Scared of losing everything. Because you're being true with yourself? I finished for him. He nodded, tears finally escaping. What do I do now? How am I supposed to navigate this? One day at a time, I replied, giving his shoulder a squeeze. And you don't have to do it alone. We sat side by side on the edge of the bed. For hours, Ethan talked about moments in his life that now made sense under a new light, past relationships that never felt quite right, and the paralyzing fear of disappointing his conservative parents, of feeling like a stranger in his own skin. You know what's odd? He said when the night was well underway. Part of me always knew. There were signs I deliberately ignored, feelings I suppressed before I even understood them. The human brain is amazing at protecting itself, I remarked. Sometimes it shields us from truths we're just not ready to face. And just like that, the conversation flowed like a thawing river. Sometimes turbulent, sometimes calm, but always moving forward. At one point I grabbed 2 beers from the minibar, and the alcohol only eased the tension further. And you? Ethan asked, glancing at me sideways. You never really talked about the end of your relationship. I took a deep breath, surprised by the question but knowing it was fair. She wanted kids, a more urban life. I wanted this. I gestured vaguely out the window, toward the distant mountains beyond the snow-covered city. In the end, I guess neither of us was willing to sacrifice our dreams. So you isolated yourself in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Cabin, I corrected, feigning offense. And technically, it's not exactly middle of nowhere. We both laughed, and for a moment, we were just 2 college friends again, sharing beers and dreams. Will, thanks. His voice had a new lightness to it, as if he had managed to leave a weight behind. I've never talked about this with anyone before. Not completely with myself. That's what friends are for. Outside, the snow kept falling, isolating us from the world. But for the first time in a long while, neither of us felt truly alone. Morning light filtered through the curtains, waking me from a heavy sleep. It took a few seconds to get my bearings. The hotel room, the conference, Ethan. I glanced at the bed next to mine. Empty, but showing signs it had been used. The sound of the shower running reassured me. He hadn't run off. After last night, part of me feared he might have regretted his vulnerability, that the daylight might bring shame or denial. I got up and walked to the window. Denver was buried under at least 20 centimeters of snow, but the sky was clear. The storm had passed. The bathroom door swung open, releasing a cloud of steam. Ethan emerged, already dressed, his hair damp. Morning, he said with a shy but genuine smile. Coffee? Desperately, I replied, returning his smile. At the hotel restaurant, I watched Ethan as we ate. There was something subtly different about him. His movements seemed more fluid, less guarded, as if he'd been shouldering a heavy armor. For so long, he'd only just realized how exhausting it was. I've been thinking, he began, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. When I get back to Yellowstone, I'm gonna find a therapist. There's also a support group in Bozeman for people who are, well, dealing with similar stuff. That sounds like a great idea. And that researcher... Ethan hesitated, a slight blush coloring his cheeks. Maybe I should talk to him. Not necessarily about us, but to get a better handle on what I felt. The worst that can happen is he doesn't feel the same, I commented. And even if that's the case, you'll gain some clarity. Exactly. He looked at me intensely. You know what else I was thinking? It's funny that I had to be stuck in a hotel room during a snowstorm to finally face something that was probably always there. Sometimes you need the outside world to stop so you can really hear your inner voice. He laughed. Since when did you get so philosophical? Must be all that time spent contemplating trees. We kept talking as we finished breakfast. We chatted about work, about the future, about basically trivial things. But there was a new quality in our exchange, a depth, an honesty that hadn't been there before. When we got back to the room to pack, Ethan paused, in the middle of what we were doing, and sat on the bed with a thoughtful look. I was so worried about what others would think. His voice was calm, reflective. My parents, my co-workers. But you know what I realized? The only judgment that really paralyzed me was my own. I nodded, completely on board. We're our harshest critics. I spent so long trying to fit into a specific definition of who I should be. The perfect son, a driven professional, a traditional man. He shook his head. I forgot to ask who I really am. And now, are you ready for that question? A slow smile spread across his face. I think I'm finally ready to hear the answer, whatever it might be. We finished packing in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. Before leaving the room, Ethan paused once more, looking around as if he wanted to memorize every detail. Funny how a place so generic can become so important, isn't it? He said. When you look back, this anonymous hotel room in Denver will be the place where I finally started to find myself. The hotel lobby was packed with people trying to rearrange their trips after the snowstorm. I managed to snag a spot on the first shuttle leaving for the west as soon as the main roads were cleared, probably in a few hours. Ethan, heading north, would have to wait a bit longer. So, I guess that's it, I said, as we placed our bags by the door. Back to our separate lives, separated by hundreds of kilometers of mountains. For now, he replied, with a conviction that surprised me. I'm not gonna let 5 more years pass before we see each other again. Deal. I held out my hand, but Ethan skipped the formal gesture and pulled me into a tight hug. Thanks, he whispered, for listening, for not judging, for being exactly the kind of friend I needed when I didn't even know I needed one. I returned the hug, realizing how long it had been since I'd experienced such genuine human connection. In my mountain retreat, I had avoided not only the pain of my failed relationship, but also the connection that comes from letting others see who we really are. You know, I said as we pulled apart, I think you weren't the only one who needed this weekend. Outside, the sun caught the snow in a dazzling, almost blinding reflection. The air was crisp and cold, just as it usually is after a storm. An attendant announced that the first shuttle heading west would depart in 30 minutes. I've got an idea, Ethan suddenly said. In the spring, when the trails open up, I could take a week off. Yellowstone isn't going to collapse. Without me. What do you have in mind? Does your cabin have space for guests? His eyes lit up. I've always wanted to really get to know that area. We could do some hiking, maybe fishing. There's a sofa bed in the living room that's never been used, I answered, surprised at how much I liked the idea. And I know all the best fishing spots that aren't on the tourist maps. Deal then. When the call for the shuttle came, there was a moment of hesitation. There was so much more to say, so many unfinished conversations, so many years to recapture. I'll be okay, Ethan said, as if reading my mind. Honestly, for the first time in a long while, I think I'm really gonna be okay. Call me when you get to Yellowstone, I asked, even if it's late. I will, he promised. And will, thanks for showing me that being honest doesn't mean losing everything. With one last wave, I grabbed my bag and headed out. Looking over my shoulder, I saw Ethan watching me leave, a solitary silhouette against the bustling lobby. But there was something different in his stance, more upright, more confident, like someone who had finally found his footing after years of stumbling. Out there, the cold air filled my lungs, refreshing, like a brand new beginning. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. The road home was surprisingly clear, considering the snowstorm from the night before. Cleaning crews had been working all through the early morning, and now the black asphalt snaked its way through walls of white snow, like a river of ink across a pristine canvas. I drove in silence. No radio, letting the events of the weekend settle in my mind. The distant mountains slowly grew larger, familiar and comforting, signaling my return to the retreat I'd built for myself. But for the first time in months, I wondered if refuge was the right word. Or if, perhaps I had turned my cabin into a fortress, not just against the pain of my ended relationship, but against the vulnerability that comes with genuine connections. Ethan had found the courage to face a fundamental truth about himself. And me? I'd been hiding in the mountains, telling myself that what I really had was peace, even though it might just be isolation. When I finally turned onto the dirt road that led to my cabin, the sun was beginning to set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I pulled over and just watched for a moment, soaking in the wild beauty that had drawn me to this place. Inside the cabin, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The same stack of books next to the armchair, the same blanket folded neatly on, the couch that never had any visitors, the same absolute stillness. But something had changed. Not the place, but me. I walked out to the back porch and gazed at the lake in the distance, now partially frozen, reflecting the colorful evening sky. I grabbed my phone and took a picture, not for me, but to send to Ethan. A quiet reminder that there'd be a place waiting for him when spring arrived. Everything's still here. The view will be waiting for you in the spring, I typed, attaching the image. The response came almost immediately. I can't wait. I'm already looking up therapists. In Bozeman, first step taken. I smiled at the screen, feeling a warmth that wasn't just from the crackling fireplace. It was the warmth of knowing that somewhere not too far away, someone was thinking of me. Someone knew my story, my fears, my flaws, and still wanted to be a part of my life. In the days that followed, I started reorganizing the cabin. I cleaned up the guest room that I'd been using as storage. I fixed the old fishing chair that had been broken for months. I even started making a mental list of the best spots to take Ethan when he finally visited. A week after the conference, I got another text from him. First therapy session today. Scary as hell, but liberating. I talked about that conversation in the hotel. That's when I realized I needed to do more than just reorganize my physical space. I needed to reorganize my life. I couldn't ask Ethan to face his fears while I continued hiding in my solitary sanctuary. The next day, for the first time in months, I accepted the park superintendent's invitation to dinner with the team. The following week, I even joined a book club in the little town nearby. Small steps, but significant ones. At night, sitting on the porch with a craft beer, I looked up at the stars and thought about how a simple work conference had turned into a turning point. Not just for Ethan, but for me too. There was something profoundly liberating about watching someone find the courage to be authentic, like somehow bravery is contagious. Sometimes, by fully accepting another person's truth, we learn to better accept our own truths. And as the cold months passed and the first signs of spring started to appear, tiny green shoots breaking through the melting snow, gradually, longer days, the return of migrating birdsong, I felt a growing sense of anticipation. It wasn't just the excitement of having Ethan visit, though that was definitely part of it. It was something deeper, a feeling of awakening along with the nature around me, emerging from a period of hibernation into something new and full of possibilities. Because sometimes, we need to see someone we love find the courage to be themselves to realize that we too can be brave. Sometimes, we need to witness someone else's journey in order to finally start our own. And if there's one thing I learned in that Denver hotel room during a snowstorm that felt orchestrated by fate, it's that our lives aren't defined by the moments when everything goes according to plan. They're defined by the times we let ourselves be truly seen, with all our doubts, fears, and imperfections, and discover that still, we are worthy of connection. This is my story. What's yours? What truth are you waiting to face? What part of yourself are you hiding from the world and from yourself? Maybe it's time to find your own Denver hotel room, your own snowstorm, your own moment of courage. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get more stories like this.